I have uncovered a very rare book about a forgotten Canadian haunting case, and it has opened the door to one of the most chilling and disturbing paranormal stories I've come across in a long time. A story where a family and an entire community are terrorized by a violent, manipulative presence. One that doesn't just move objects, but speaks, uttering obscene, filthy things no child should ever hear.
Would you like to come to hell with me?
And after a painstaking quest to trace this property, I spoke to the current owners. It seems that whatever was there may have lingered long after the events themselves. Prepare your spine for shivers, because I'm Peter Laws, and this is Into the Fog. If you drive west out of Ottawa, Canada, the suburbs slowly dissolve into open country. The highways narrow, and the forests thicken. And if you follow the 148 for just over an hour, and once you pass Shoreville, you come off and join the gravel lanes of Clarendon. Clarendon is not very well known. A drive through this large rural area can feel like you're going back in time, surrounded by stretches of farmland, tall grass and meadows, corn silos and poultry farms, and isolated farmhouses. It's quiet here, other than the rumble of trucks and the constant hiss of insects in the fields. But back in 1889, in a farmhouse on this land, something chose to break that quiet, something that wanted to be heard. And it happened at the Dagg family farm. George Dagg was in his 30s. Susan, his wife, was 25. And they had various children, but when I read Lambert's book, he specifically just mentions 4-year-old Mary and 1-year-old Johnny. But after checking the records, we also discovered another child, which will add a very chilling element to this case, but more on that later. Well, the Daggs wanted a bigger family, and so they chose to adopt a girl. She was called Dinah McLean. And at first I just figured they wanted to expand their family, but it seems rather more calculated than that. You see, Dinah came from an orphanage in Bellevue, Ontario, and I decided to check that out, and it's probably Marchmont Orphanage where she came from, which has a rather grim history. You see, from 1875 until 1925, that home and others shipped over 10,000 orphan children from Britain so they could be used as cheap labor on the fields of Canada. They even had names for these kids back then: gutternips, street Arabs, little immigrants, labour children. Some even called them the dregs of London. And yes, some were received into loving families, but others were told, "You are here to work." Well, Dinah was one of those dregs. She'd grown up in Scotland, but lost her parents, and she lived in a place called the Parish Poorhouse in Glasgow, and it was just a horrible place to be. But then one day, knock on her door, if she even had a door, and she was told to grab your stuff, you're moving. Not to another place in Scotland, but to Canada. She was sent as one of those labour children, and her new home was the Dagg family farm. So she moved into this one-story dwelling that was built from logs. It had an attic and a shed at the back, and it was modest, but it was new. They hadn't even shingled the roof yet. And it was on Sunday, September the 15th, that the strange activity began. Before we continue with the video, a quick thank you to our partner, CyberGhost VPN, for sponsoring this episode. A lot of people think that incognito mode protects their privacy online, but it doesn't. Your internet provider, your workplace, your local network, even your Wi-Fi router can still see and track what you're doing online. And that is where CyberGhost VPN comes in. CyberGhost encrypts and reroutes your internet traffic through its secure service, which keeps your browsing activity private. And with over 100 locations to choose from worldwide, you can unlock geo-restricted content from over 40 streaming platforms, including Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+. CyberGhost works across all major devices: Windows, Mac OS, iOS, and Android. Plus, you can protect up to 7 devices at the same time. It's perfect for sharing with friends and family. With over 38 million users worldwide and more than 20,000 excellent reviews on Trustpilot, CyberGhost is one of the most trusted VPN providers. It's a great service that gives me peace of mind online. With the link in the description, you can get their best deal, just $2.03 a month, plus 4 months free. That is 84% off. There's even a 45-day money-back guarantee, so there's nothing to lose by trying it. And thanks again to CyberGhost VPN for supporting the channel. George Dagg had come home with some money, a $5 bill and a $2 bill. And he gave this money to his wife, Susan, asked her to put it in a bureau for safekeeping. Now, at the time, the Daggs had a second orphan child working there temporarily. His name was Dean, and he slept in a bed in the attic. On Monday, September the 16th, Dean came down the attic ladder which opened into the kitchen, and he went to light a fire on the stove. Something on the floor caught his eye. He leaned in and he saw a $5 bill lying in front of the stove. Now he thought, I guess he could have slipped that into his pocket, but he didn't do that. He was an honest kid, and he went to find George. He said, "Look, I found this money." Confused, George quickly checked the bureau, and the $5 bill was not there, but the $2 bill was gone as well. George thought for a moment and sent Dean out to milk the cows, and once Dean was out of the way, George went up to the attic to search it, and he found the $2 bill lying in Dean's bed. Well, naturally, he assumed that Dean must have stolen both bills. But he didn't confront the boy there and then. He decided to watch, to find more evidence of this kid's bad behavior, and they got some evidence later that morning, but it was rather more disgusting than they ever imagined. Susan Dagg spent that Monday morning in the milk house. When she came back into the kitchen, I was appalled at what she saw. The stench hit her first, but then, as she looked down, she saw a trail of feces on the floor. Someone had literally smeared a line of it from the back door to the front. It was absolutely repulsive. She looked closer, realized it wasn't even from an animal, it was human. The farm had an outdoor toilet. Someone had been out there, scooped up some of the filth, and had smeared it throughout the house. Well, sickened, she told George, and the two of them could no longer stay quiet, so they stomped to Dean and they accused him not only of stealing, but of malicious vandalism. Dean's jaw just dropped. He said, "I didn't do that. That wasn't me." His denial sent George into a rage. He grabbed Dean and he marched him to the nearest magistrate so they could charge him with theft. But listen to this. While George was doing that, something very strange happened back in the farmhouse. Susan must have cleaned up the mess by now, but it didn't matter because as she was going about her day, she suddenly noticed the smell again, and she was shocked to see a fresh smearing of human excrement. But this time, it was all over the place. It was in the beds. It was rubbed across other parts of the house. It was even smeared on the food cupboard, and I mean all over the food itself. It was awful. But the most significant part, of course, was this. Susan knew that these areas had been clear not long before, and now they'd been soiled after Dean had been dragged off by George. So that kid could not have done this, and probably didn't steal the money either. So she got word to George, and Dean was let off the hook, thankfully. Though there were some who would later wonder, did Dean curse the family and cause the remaining haunting because of their false accusation? Well, the finding of human waste smeared throughout the house persisted in the coming days, and Susan decided the only way to protect her food was to go up to the attic and put it up there. You see, the attic had just a hatch. It didn't really have a door or a window up there to get in and out of, and so she could keep an eye on the hatch during the day. And yet whenever she would go up later to check on the food, it was covered with human waste again. How was that even possible? Well, it appeared that the impossible was starting to become commonplace on the Dagg family farm that week, because they then heard a mouth organ being played in the house. They tried to figure out who could possibly be making this music, but they found it. The melody was coming from a shelf. When they looked at the shelf, they found an untouched harmonica lying there. How was it being played? Dishes were found smashed into pieces. Objects were rearranged in nonsensical ways. For example, milk would vanish from the milk pans only to be replaced by chunks of butter. A large dining room table at one point even lifted off the ground and slammed down in front of them all. Lambert says this: "A rocking chair began rocking furiously, but there was nobody in it and nobody to push it." Terrifying. A pitcher of water had been standing on the side when suddenly that lifted up and it launched itself right at Susan Dagg's face. And it just kept getting worse. Around the middle of that week, it was around 18th to the 19th of September, George Dagg had to go away from home. It was threshing season where, when farmers separate the edible grain from the harvested stalk. So he was off doing that. And unsurprisingly, it seems like Susan did not want to be in the house alone because the account says that George's dad, John J. Dagg, came over to stay with Susan and the kids while George was away. But something astonishing happened. They were sitting in the house when suddenly the air just erupted with the sound of a massive crashing sound. The glass pane in the front window crashed inwards, sending shards of glass into the front room. John Dagg leapt up from his chair and he raced outside to confront whatever vandal had thrown a rock through the window, because surely that's what was happening. There was nobody there. He scanned the fields, nothing. He went back inside the house, looked on the floor, and saw nothing but glass. There was no rock or brick even amongst it. So how do you explain this smashing? Well, what he did find was another window pane at the back of the house that had also smashed. But they realized it must have smashed at the exact same time as the front window because they'd only heard one crash. What was going on? Well, John was determined to find out and he wanted to catch the culprit. So he found a nifty little hiding place in the barn. And once he was in place, he knocked out one of the wooden boards so he could kind of spy through the spy hole, and from there he could see the house and the grounds and he could keep an eye at it. Yet as he sat there on his little stakeout, nobody came, and he waited and waited, but then he heard Susan's frantic voice coming over from the house, and she was shouting,
"Father, you may as well come in. The glass is still breaking."
He leapt up and ran inside and found chaos. 8 panes of glass shattered that day. This was a violent poltergeist, and not only that, it was vindictive too. The 4-year-old daughter, Mary, she was standing at the open front door of the house that week when something came whizzing through the air, and it smacked her very hard on the chest. She's only a little kid. It was a large rock, and it had been flung at speed. Now, where it had come from, nobody could figure out. But just as mysterious, young Susan did not cry out or reach for her chest in pain, and when they checked on her, somehow, this is so weird, somehow she just barely felt this stone smacking into her. But then the fires began. Spontaneous fires started to erupt on the Dagg farm. Sometimes they would find the curtains had flames licking up them. They would discover other household objects that were smouldering or even on fire right in front of them. There was one day when the Dagg family counted 8 separate fires. Now, this is where I want to mention a startling bit of information that we uncovered. It's not in Lambert's book, which is surprising, and I think it can only mean that he must have decided to leave it out of respect for the family, perhaps. But listen, remember how I said that Lambert only mentions some of the Dagg children? He chose not to talk about their daughter Eliza Jane Dagg, who was clearly there in the genealogies when we checked. And when we looked at the Dagg family tree, we saw that Eliza was born in 1885. But it was when she died that really got my attention. 1889. That was the year of the poltergeist. And I thought, well, maybe it happened earlier that year, so Lambert didn't think to mention it. But as we dug deeper, we found the date of her death. And that was the 16th of August, 1889. That was right in the middle of the haunting. Now, turning to the newspaper records, we then found an article in the Ottawa Citizen from 1957. In that, they were speaking to an 85-year-old local man called Charlie Harris. And he had always wondered if maybe the haunting could have been faked. He thought the Daggs were trying to drive out a neighbor called Mrs. Wallace from the land. More on her later. But in the same article, Charlie just casually mentions this bit of shocking information. He says, A tragic accident put an end to the haunting. According to Charlie, the Dagg's little girl, Lisa Jane, was burned to death in the yard when her clothes caught on fire near a pot of soap that was boiling. Now, since we know that Eliza Jane Dagg died in the house at the time of the haunting, it seems very likely that Lisa Jane is actually Liza Jane. And it's a really disturbing element of the case because the family had reported so many unexplained fires in the house. I can only guess that maybe Lambert chose not to mention the little girl's death out of respect for the family. Maybe he just felt that was more appropriate. They might not have wanted that detail shared with the world at the time. I don't know. But does this mean that whatever was in the house was even prepared to murder them? Well, we can't say. What happened to Eliza really may have just been a horrible accident in the midst of a haunting. But make no mistake, this presence certainly wanted to actively terrorize these people. Like Dinah, for example. She wore long hair braided into a pigtail. In the UK, we call them ponytails. And it was so long that it ran all the way down her back. One afternoon, Dinah was in the farmhouse when she suddenly felt her head snap back painfully, and she let out this awful shriek, crying out that someone was grabbing her ponytail, and whoever was doing it was yanking it and dragging it incredibly hard. And make no mistake, I am not exaggerating about how hard it was, because Susan Dagg rushed in and found Dinah screaming. And when she hurried behind the little girl, well, Susan threw her hand across her mouth because Dinah's pigtail was literally hanging off. Not like it had been pulled off all the way, but that it had been pulled and then cut. Lambert says her hair was as if sawn off roughly by a knife and hanging by a few strands only. That poor girl must have been in absolute agony, and so Susan had to cut the rest of the hair with some scissors, just so, she didn't risk getting it caught or ripping it away later. Plus, it looked a mess. But that very same day, Johnny Dagg, the other kid, started screaming, and Susan rushed to him and was horrified. Chunks of hair had been literally ripped out of that little boy's scalp. Well, the haunting had grown so vicious and violent that the family had only one possible explanation. They had been bewitched. And it didn't take them long to figure out a prime suspect. You remember that neighbor I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Wallace? Well, they had an ongoing dispute with her about the boundary of their property, tale as old as time. And this must be why old Charlie Harris said the haunting was more to do with the land dispute, because of this argument they had, perhaps. But anyway, after the violent attacks, George started to think that his neighbor had put a hex on their house and family. To figure out if this was true, he decided to consult a woman who had a talent for discernment. Originally from Ireland, Elizabeth Barnes was known as the Witch of Plum Hollow. She had a reputation as a wise woman with supernatural abilities, and she would regularly receive people into her attic room where they would seek supernatural advice, sometimes for personal issues, for lost items, even for political counsel. Now, apparently, the last man hanged for murder in Brockville was convicted with the police assistance of the Witch of Plum Hollow. So George went straight off to visit the witch, which I assume meant a train ride because I looked at the maps and there's quite a distance between him. But he met her. She used to meet people inside the attic of her little spooky little cabin that she used to live in. And he went there and he shared his story of what was going on at the farm. She listened carefully, and then, to find an answer, she carried out a lengthy seance or whatever it was that she did to connect with the other side or the forces to tell her what was going on. And once she did, she came back with a response that confirmed George's theory. She looked up from her trance and said, "Your family is under a curse. And the target of the curse, however, is not just the family. It's that little orphan that you've taken on. Dinah, she is the target." But she also said that this curse had been brought about by what she described as the black art. And she said 3 people had carried this curse out. A young girl, a young boy, and a woman. and all three lived very close to the Dagg farm. Well, George Dagg had his confirmation. Mrs. Wallace must be the woman, and her kids. How would he confront her? Well, it's interesting because after George Dagg went to see the woman at Plum Hollow, there was a dramatic and scary increase in the paranormal activity at the farm. You see, Dinah was now starting to see physical manifestations. It was frightening. One day, Susan Dagg had just made up one of the beds in the house when she heard a terrible scream. It was Dinah, and when Susan ran to help her, this 11-year-old was in an absolute state. She said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Dinah said,
"Look, can you see the big black thing pulling off the bedclothes?"
Susan froze for a moment, then slowly turned to where Dinah was pointing and gasped. No, she didn't see the black shape, but she did see a heap of Dinah's clothes. They were hanging in the air, like they were being lifted by somebody unseen. The arms in the middle and the clothes sort of drooping down at the edge. Was this the black thing? Susan whispered.
"Where is it, Dinah?"
Dinah was freaking out. She says,
"Don't you see him? He's leaning over the bedstead."
Well, at this, Susan bolted out the room to fetch a whip, and she came back gasping, and she handed this whip to Dinah. She said, "Hit it, Dinah. Stand up and whack this black thing, whatever it is." Well, Dinah didn't take the whip at first. She just stared at the handle. 11-year-old girl being asked to confront and physically attack what could well be a demon in her room, perhaps even the devil himself. But Susan urged her on. Do it, whip it." So Dinah stood up, took the whip in her hand. Fair play to her. She did as she was asked. She walked over to this black thing and she whipped it. She struck it. She did this several times, which caused quite a commotion because one of their neighbors, the Dagg's neighbors, was in the house at the time, a man called Arthur Smart. He heard the racket, he came running into the room, and he saw what was happening. And though Lambert doesn't say if he too saw the black figure, it does record that he started urging Dinah on, saying, "Give it to him, don't be afraid." And so Dinah hit this black thing harder and harder, striking it. And as she did, the room just erupted in this hideous, inhuman squeal. And it sounded exactly, it says, like a pig. And at the sound of that animalistic wailing, Dinah stopped whipping and said,
"He's gone."
Later, they found a piece of paper and it was scrawled with a message. It was a message from the black thing, it appeared.
"You have given me 15 cats."
Now, at first that made no sense to me. I was a bit confused. But turns out it was an old way of saying 15 lashes. Like from a cat of 9 tails. Have you ever heard that phrase, "There's not enough room to swing a cat in here," and people think it literally means a cat? It doesn't. It's talking about a cat of 9 tails, a whip. Isn't it interesting to think that a ghost or a spirit or a demon or whatever this thing was has the ability and the interest in counting things? Well, the presence wanted to appear to children, it seemed, because then young Mary and Johnny started to see hideous figures too, loping around the house. They saw a mysterious black dog at one point, and later a handsome man dressed in white with long white hair. Mary's encounter with a physical manifestation was particularly scary. Listen to this. She said she had seen something.
It was like a man with the head, horns, and feet of a cow standing at the front door.
And she said that this hideous, inhuman figure was very tall and very thin. At another time, Mary said that she saw the same spindly figure, only it was leaning over the oven, putting sugar into it. Now, the first time she'd seen this figure at the front door, the thing hadn't noticed her. But the second time at the oven was different. It knew it was being observed because Mary said when she looked over at it, she saw it leaning over the oven and it paused, and then slowly it turned its bovine head towards her and it locked its eyes on her, and it opened its mouth and spoke. And it said,
Little girl, would you like to come to hell with me?
Some viewers might be surprised that the family had not called in the church yet. But as soon as Mary said that this ghoulish figure started inviting her to hell, the Daggs admitted that a consultation with the local pastor was way overdue. And so they called a Mr. Horner, but he wasn't available, so instead Horner sent his brother, who arrived at the farmhouse. The first thing that this Mr. Horner did was ask for a Bible. They gave him one and he laid it on a chair in front of him. And then he gathered the Dagg family and he started to pray for God's protection over them. As soon as he looked upwards with an amen, he frowned. The Bible was gone. He literally just put it on the chair, but the chair was now empty. Well, he paused the prayer session for a while so he could look around for it, but it was gone and nobody had been in to take it. Others joined in the search. They opened drawers and cupboards and leaned under beds. Do you want to know where they found it? It was inside that kitchen oven, the same place the cow-headed demon or entity or whatever it was had invited Mary to hell. And whether it was for its own amusement or a threat to them all, the creature had taken the symbol of their faith and love and hope and tossed it into the place of fire. This, it was saying, this won't help you. Now, if this Horner brother thought someone had taken the Bible just to trick him, he would soon realize that the cause of all of this was far more unnatural than he thought. Because later that same day, he noticed that an inkstand kept vanishing from the kitchen table. Whenever it went missing, they would find it again in the woodshed. They would put it back into the kitchen, and later they'd see it appear again in the shed. And so Horner decided to stake out this little inkstand. He would watch it closely, perhaps to finally catch the prankster who must be slipping in to take it each time, surely. Imagine the shock of his face when during this little vigil, he saw that inkstand simply wink out of existence right before his eyes. And yes, they found it, as expected, in the woodshed. Now, George's mother, Mary Dagg, was in the house one day. She was holding a bottle of vinegar. She was so used to the haunting by now that she said this.
I'm quite afraid to set it down for fear that the goblin will break it.
Isn't it interesting that she called this thing a goblin? Well, the presence was listening clearly, because as soon as she said this, a potato whizzed across the room and it smashed into her hand, the one that was holding the vinegar bottle. Now, I don't know if she dropped the bottle or not, but the intention was clear. The presence in this house was watching them and listening to them and counting the things they did, and it was determined to torment not only the Dagg family, but anyone else who might happen to set foot in the place. Because you see, it started to show that it was able to be active beyond the walls of the house itself. Here's an example. John Quinn lived nearby. One of the neighbors, news of this haunting was spreading now, so he decided to pop in for himself to see what was going on. He guided the horse to the pasture, took off its halter. A halter is like a bit of kit that you put in front of like a strap on the horse's head to lead it around. He put the halter down on the doorstep at the Dagg house, went inside, saw what was going on, and then later he came back out. The halter was gone. A full search found nothing, and he got other people to help him with it, because a whole group of them wound up way off the farm, and with them was George Dagg, George's parents, and this woman called Mary Smart and her children. This group were discussing the events when suddenly they heard a strange, ever so slight kind of whistling noise in the air. What happened next was astonishing. The halter they had been looking for fell right at their feet. The moment it hit the dirt, of course, some of them immediately spun their heads around trying to find whoever had just flung it over their heads just now. There's nobody there. And as they stared at this thing, just lying on the grass, a coldness must have crept through them. Because whatever haunted the Dagg farmhouse had shown it was quite capable of strolling through these fields and causing havoc well beyond that building. Yet what turned these events to a far darker place, and what makes this case one of the most unique you'll ever hear, is what the entity chose to do next. It began to speak. Dinah already had to cope with the unwanted attention of the presence, from its appearing as a large black thing to yanking her hair half off. But now, she was telling George and Sarah Dagg that this spectral stranger in the house was talking to her. And it spoke, she said, in a very gruff voice, saying horrible things to her, obscene things. Lambert puts it this way: the kind of remarks it uttered were not such as an 11-year-old maiden would expect to hear from a stranger. In fact, most of the remarks were grossly indecent. He said that the voice would follow her everywhere she went, talking and whispering repulsive adult words, whether she was in bed, whether she was, out walking, trying to get away. She couldn't get away. Now, around this time, an important figure enters this case. His name was Mr. Percy Woodcock. He was an artist from Brockville in Ontario, and he lived there with his wife, Eliza. He was a son of a Christian minister, but Percy tended to believe that all religions really lead to the same God, and so he became a follower of the Baha'i faith. He's he might be the first Baha'i believer in Brockville. Anyway, back in 1889, Percy hadn't discovered his Baha'i faith quite yet, but he did take a very keen interest in the paranormal. So when news of this haunting reached Brockville, he hired a carriage to drive him the 7 miles to Dagg Farm. George and Susan were used to locals turning up by now, but when Percy came at the door, they told him he was going to be disappointed. You see, Dinah had been staying at the time 2 miles away at George's parents' house, and they said, look, when Dinah's not here, the haunting stops. Well, he travelled all this way, and he seemed to be a bit persistent because they agreed to get word to her to come back early the following day to meet this Percy man. While he waited, Percy interviewed the Daggs about everything that had happened. He then walked around the local area, meeting multiple neighbours and others, talking about the haunting, getting their witness statements, making copious handwritten notes. His plan was to draw all of these notes together for a story in his local paper, the Brockville Recorder and Times. The next day, on Saturday, November the 16th, 1889, Percy Woodcock finally met Dinah, and when he saw her walk in, he was shocked. She had been described to him thus far as a stout, rosy-cheeked Scottish lassie. Yet the girl who walked into the house that day looked anything but. She was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and exhausted darkness around her eyes. The strain of the haunting had caused significant loss of weight, and she looked like skin and bone. She told him that she'd just seen something strange behind the house as she was walking home, something near the water well. Well, Percy leapt up and the two of them rushed out to sea, and they stood for a moment as Dinah looked over at the shed. The shed had its door open, and Dinah called out to the open door saying,
"Are you there, mister?"
What happened next was astonishing. A voice, deep and rough sounding, slithered out of the darkness of that shed. And it was an old man's tone, sleazy and harsh, and it unleashed a torrent of lewd, sexualized obscenity at Percy, and he heard it. Well, the artist was in shock and couldn't speak for a moment as his voice just ranted on, and then finally he found the courage to say something. He said,
"Who are you?"
I am the devil. Get out of this, or I will break your neck.
Percy replied to this blatant threat with boldness. He said,
"That kind of language may impress farmers or scare kids. It won't go down with me. You, voice, or whatever you are, ought to be ashamed of yourself for using such filthy talk in front of a young girl."
The voice replied by spitting out insults in Percy's direction. Now, was Percy just a bit of a badass in the face of supernatural evil? Maybe. But his bravery may have come from the thought that he didn't believe this. Because after a heated exchange, he searched the shed thoroughly to see if someone was in there pretending to be the devil. The shed was empty. And so a thought crossed his mind. What about Dinah herself? What if, even at her young age, she had mastered the art of ventriloquism? Speaking without moving the mouth. A local had suggested that this might be how Dinah was causing this voice to be heard. What if they were right? So, to test this, he said to Dinah, "Going to the well, get a bit of water, drink it, but do not swallow it. Come back here with your mouth full." So she did as she was told, and he watched her fill her mouth and come back. The voice carried on speaking, crisp and clear. Now Percy was convinced this was not the little girl causing this. Just then, George Dagg came up to join them, and he mentioned that this was not the first time this thing had communicated with them. Can you remember when the paper had said, "You have given me 15 cats"? Well, Percy thought up another test based on this. He placed a pencil and paper on a bench in the shed, and then he called out into the dusty air,
Be kind enough to write something that I can show my friends.
No.
Percy asked again, "Please write something for me." I know how crazy this sounds, but Percy claims that both he and George, and possibly some other witnesses at the time, saw the pencil start to move and drag itself, scraping lines on the paper. But what was written on the paper looked indecent.
I asked for something I could show my friends.
And at this, the voice grew angry and sharp, saying,
I'll steal your pencil.
And the pencil then shot across the room and landed at the far end of the shed. Well, George felt they needed a break from all this, and so they left the shed to go back to the farmhouse. But as they were walking back to the farmhouse, this presence, this thing, followed them, like frantically talking to them as they moved towards the house. And then as they sat in the farmhouse hoping to get away from it, the voice just kept talking. And in fact, it was talking for the best part of that day. Lambert says it went on for 5 hours in total. Long enough for Percy to be able to step out of the conversation and search the house for the prankster to find whoever might be doing this voice. He couldn't find anyone. Long enough for neighbors and passers-by to come in and to hear the voice for themselves and to be shocked at its filthy language. It then seemed to stop swearing at one point and try to reassure everyone. It said it was only having fun, that it didn't mean any harm. Except, that is, towards Dinah and Percy. For some reason, this presence said it hated them both. For example, the voice even apologized for throwing the rock at little Mary Dagg at the start of the haunting. Remember when she stood in the doorway, she got hit in the chest? It said it didn't mean to hit Mary. It was aiming at Dinah. And can you remember what the Dagg said about the activity stopping when Dinah wasn't home? That has led some to believe that Dinah was the problem, somehow bringing the haunting on. But listen to how the voice replied to a question from George when he said,
What were you doing when Dinah was away? And why didn't we hear you?
I wanted the people to think it was Dinah.
This raises a seriously disturbing idea that we could apply to many more hauntings, but we will get back to that at the end. Well, Percy was shocked by the voice, trying to pin down all the blame on Dinah, and he responded to the thing, saying,
Shame on you. If you don't behave better, I'll take Dinah away.
If you take Dinah away, I'll try it on little Mary.
Again, this thing shifted its focus to a female child. The conversation also included a discussion of Mrs. Wallace, the neighbor.
What are your reasons for persecuting the Dagg family?
Mrs. Wallace sends me.
Will your engagement with Mrs. Wallace soon cease?
I won't tell you. Shut up. You meddle with the black art. I will break your neck, for I am the devil, the son of the blessed.
The devil said that they must now go to Mrs. Wallace and her 2 young accomplices and force them to confess their sins. Percy said, "Okay, I'll go and get her later." And the voice said, "No, you won't." And at this, Percy got up and said, "Yes, I will." And he went straight over to Mrs. Wallace's house. It was dark by then, and there were a lot of space between these houses, so it took a little walk. And I do wonder, I could picture it, how Percy must have felt being thrown into this supernatural freak show and now walking alone towards the home of the woman and her children who had supposedly orchestrated it all. Was it scary for him? Maybe. Well, he knocked on the door, and when she answered, he was straight with her, saying, "You have been accused of witchery, of cursing your neighbor. Will you come over to the Dagg house to face the accusation?" What would you do in that scenario? Maybe write in the comments, would you have gone to the house or would you not? Well, she was not keen on this, but Percy was clearly a persuasive guy, because she finally did agree to come. And by the time they got back, the house was now filled with people. And as she walked through the threshold of the home, the voice became excited at her approach, because it burst into a sudden flurry of sick abuse towards this woman.
You've made charges against this woman behind her back. Now make them to her face.
Old Mother Wallace, didn't you and Maggie and Willie go to the swamp and bury a black art book that you got in Montreal?
No, I did not.
You did.
I say I did not.
You lie.
This argument went on and on, with Mrs. Wallace challenging its version of events, and the voice began then to contradict itself. Mrs. Wallace noticed this. She pointed that out and said, "You're not making sense." And the presence got enraged.
You make me lie.
As the conversation went on, everyone was starting to understand. Mrs. Wallace had done nothing. This entity, this thing, was a liar. Which would make sense if it was the devil, for doesn't the Bible call the devil the prince of lies? So they all believed Mrs. Wallace was innocent. And they brought her kids to the voice, and it similarly got confused and stumbled over itself. At first it said that her and the kids had used a book of black magic, and that the thing could show George Dagg exactly where they'd buried this book, but then moments later it lost track of itself and talked about how it had burned that book to ashes and it was no more. This thing was all over the place. This does remind me of the sort of things that I would encounter on the many Ouija board sessions I used to have as a teenager with friends. Something would speak through the board and it was scary, but I would just notice time and again it would contradict itself, showing itself to be just untrustworthy. Well, the voice finally agreed that it would leave the Dagg family in peace, promising to vacate the farm the following night on a Sunday. And Percy said, "Why don't you leave right now?"
Because tomorrow there will be a lot more people here, and I want to convince the unbelievers.
And with that, the long conversation came to an end. It was 2 a.m. Everyone went home, thoroughly shaken by the events of the day, while Percy arranged to sleep over at the nearby home of a man called Arthur Smart. His mind was reeling with what he'd seen, but more by what he'd heard. At least the spectral voice was truthful about one thing, at least. The next day, a crowd of gawkers really did come to the farm, since the story of the talking ghost had spread further. I found a newspaper article that said 200 buggy loads of people came to the house in one day. And people would come to this farmhouse, they would hear the voice, they would even have conversations with it. They left amazed, but often shaken and disturbed, because the entity would show a shockingly intimate knowledge of their private life. People would come staggering out of that farmhouse saying, "It knows things. It knows things about me that no one else could know." Listen to this eerie example. One man had tragically lost his daughter to an illness, and he said that when he spoke to the voice, it shared intimate details about the very last conversation this dad had had with his child, as if the presence had been there on that day. crouching by the bed, listening in. He told all of this to the gathered people, insisting that nobody, and he meant nobody, had heard a word of what he had said to his dying daughter that day. But the voice knew. This made people wonder if the voice might not be a devil at all, but an angel. The voice seemed to pick up on this and suddenly switched personalities.
I am not that person who used the dirty language. I am an angel from heaven, sent by God to drive away that fellow.
Some in the crowd began to believe that, thinking they might be in the midst of a divine presence, but Percy Woodcock was having none of it. He chastised those people for falling for these lies. He said, the voice never changes, but it says it's the devil, it says it's an angel. At one point, the voice even claimed that it was a discarnate spirit of an 80-year-old man who had died 20 years before. Sure enough, the angel's voice became angry and slipped back into crude, nasty outbursts. Percy had drawn up a detailed report of the bizarre events at Dagg Farm, knowing that he was now in the presence of many actual witnesses that day, so many of them that he had an idea. He gathered people around him, and then he read his report aloud. And he asked them all to corroborate what he'd recorded and to point out any corrections or mistakes. And once he did that, he picked people out of the crowd, the ones that had been most exposed to these strange happenings, and once they were in full agreement with what he'd written, his account, he asked them to sign the document, stating that everything had happened just as he said it had. Now, I've used the wording of that document, which you'll find in this book, but also the book itself and all the newspaper reports and all these other things as the basis for this episode. And it was signed that day by 17 witnesses. 17. Well, now that Percy Woodcock had the signed document, he was ready for a rest from all of this relentless haunting. So he left the Dagg Farm at about 10:30 p.m. that night. I guess he went back to Arthur Smart's house because he didn't go back to Brockville just yet. And in Percy's absence, the voice kept on talking to the people who stayed around to listen. And it started to get scary for them. Someone at one point decided to call a couple of prominent church ministers, and they said that it should come and exorcise the farm. I think they were starting to realize that this was not so much a haunting as a demonic infestation. Neither minister could be found, so they called in a Baptist pastor, a guy called Reverend Bell. Bell did not want to come, but he did feel unable to refuse, and so he arrived at the house and he spoke to the eerie voice, and he attempted an exorcism, but the presence just broke out into this skin-crawling laughter, and it told the pastor,
Stick to photography.
The pastor was astonished and embarrassed. Photography was indeed his hobby. Well, the crowd began to pray, and as they sang hymns, the voice tried to sing the hymns with them. But then, at around 3 a.m, the presence, the angel, the demon, the ghost, the goblin, whatever it was, stopped speaking. And it never spoke again. The presence of Dagg Farm was finally gone. When Percy Woodcock arrived the next morning, he was pleased to hear that the voice had stopped. So he finished off some notes and was ready to say goodbye to the Dagg family when the door of the farmhouse swung open. 3 children, locals, ran in. They were frantically saying that they had just seen a ghost walking around the front yard. Only it had taken on the appearance of an angelic being, leaving behind a line of flames as it walked. Well, Percy ran outside but saw nothing. The events were, in his mind, over. And he went back to Brockville after that, and he submitted his report to the local newspaper, and it was printed. And people read it all around that area and shivered. 1 week later, Percy decided to go back to Clarendon just to check out, see how things are going on. On the way, he bumped into an agent of the Royal Oil Company of Toronto, a guy called Andrew Watson. Andrew, it turned out, had read Percy's article, and he was on his way to Clarendon too, because he wanted to gather evidence of his own. And Andrew got off the train at Shawville on the 27th of November, and he interviewed the local pastor, Reverend Bell. Bell confirmed that he had heard the voice, that there was no natural explanation of it, and he also vouched for the honest nature of the Dagg family. Andrew Watson then started to travel to Clarendon, and he was meeting all of these locals who'd been involved in this. And after interviewing them, he was impressed that the people truly did believe what Percy had reported. They believed it because they saw it happen. Andrew went to the Dagg farm too, and he was shown where the fire started, where the glass shattered, where the furniture moved. He said he actually became quite exhausted, moving from local to local, trying to find someone who would question the events, but everyone was consistent. And after his extensive interviews, he was convinced, as much as Percy Woodcock was, this haunting was real. What do you think? Did the Dagg set up this story as one huge hoax? Well, of course it is possible. But the question would be, why? How did it benefit the family? Well, George Dagg went on to become one of the most prominent farmers in the region and eventually served as mayor of Portage for 16 years, right until his death in 1938. I've never heard of a faked haunting being the first step in the plan to gain political office, have you? So perhaps he thrived not because of the haunting, but in spite of it. I found his obituary in the Ottawa Citizen, which doesn't mention the haunting at all. It just praises George Dagg as someone well known throughout the district as someone approachable and charitable and respected. Did Dinah fake the haunting? Was she an expert ventriloquist who could throw her voice successfully and deceive hundreds of people? Well, Lambert argues if it was ventriloquism, whoever did it was an absolute master at it, which rather begs the question, if you're that good at ventriloquism, why would you stop doing it? Surely this skill would be used again and again. You go on the road, you become famous for it. And yet the frightening case of Dagg Farm stopped as suddenly as it had started. To me, it does seem doubtful that Dinah created this. Indeed, she was left traumatized by it all. And besides, that's not even to go into the fact of all these things that were witnessed by independent witnesses. The physical things, the moving things, the smashing windows, all of it. Well, this case remained all but forgotten, apart from in the memories of a few old-timers, but the story did get revived somewhat in 1953, when R.S. Lambert wrote this rare book exploring the supernatural. And his chapter on the Dagg case, called The Ghost That Talked, was then made into a 30-minute film. Now, that film isn't available to watch online, so I got in touch with the Canadian Film Board, and they do hold a copy, and they kindly allowed me to watch it. And while it is unnecessarily padded out with a bunch of random humor scenes, it does contain a decent amount of eerie activity as described in the book, but there's way more that goes on in the book. Now, I'd hope to be able to share some stills or video from it in this episode for you to see, but the costs to get the rights to do that were just really way too high for a channel of my size, so I'm afraid I wasn't able to do that. But what I can tell you is that R.S. Lambert himself appears in the film, and as he is interviewed, he is firmly convinced that the supernatural world does indeed exist, and that the Dagg Farm Haunting is one of its most striking examples. And what about today? Might there still be paranormal activity on this farm or the land around it? Well, in my research for the case, I was able to locate the precise location of Dagg Family Farm today. But to respect the privacy of the owners, I'm not going to be sharing the address publicly like this, though I did reach out to them. They did kindly get back in touch with me very quickly, and they said, important to know this, they said there hasn't been any paranormal events there in recent years. However, they have lived there since 1984, and they have indeed witnessed strange activity in the past. Why do I know that? Well, because in 2014, Chris Lackner of the Ottawa Citizen went on a hunt to find the Dagg Farmhouse, and after talking to local historians, he also tracked down the location. He visited and spoke to the owners, who lived there with their grown-up daughter. Some of the family said to Chris Lackner that they had heard footsteps coming up the creaking floorboards of the stairs to their room, stopping outside the door. She'd assumed it was one of her siblings playing a prank and threw the door open. There was nobody there. One of the upstairs doors would open and close by itself. and they had even seen what appeared to be a little girl about 3 or 4 years old in a white gown coming down the stairs. She would cross down the hall and through the kitchen door. The report does mention a young child dying after the haunting. I don't know if they were aware at the time that Eliza Dagg died at the house during the haunting, like we discovered earlier. She was 3 or 4 years old at the time of her death. Is that who this family was seeing back then? Eliza? They also said that they have heard disturbing sounds coming from the attic, crawling and scratching, but definitely not squirrels or mice. They say it more like sounds like the Mouse Olympics up there. And it was a bit nerve-wracking to imagine themselves going up to check and finding that there was nothing making these sounds, nothing visible at least. They did not mention hearing any voices. It's also interesting to note that the Dagg house has had extensions built onto it, so it's larger than it used to be, but it appears that the subsequent paranormal activity only happens in the old part of the farmhouse. It's pretty interesting. But like I said, they told me that in recent years it has been quiet. Now, before we bring this episode to a close, I do think there's one final element to this case that you need to consider. I think it's important. It might shed a disturbing light on many of the haunting stories we hear on this channel, or maybe that you hear on other channels or elsewhere. How many times have you heard people say that a poltergeist always revolves around an adolescent girl? You hear that idea so often, it's almost cliche. And sometimes hauntings happen without such a person present, but who are we kidding? There really are a significant amount of cases that do seem to orbit around a young teenage girl. And when that girl leaves the location, the activity can sometimes come to a stop. When this happens, people might put the blame on the girl. Perhaps she is creating the activity with her mind or inner turmoil, like cases of spontaneous psychokinesis. That can be one theory. Or some might even claim that the young girl is encouraging the demonic presence or somehow even unlocking ghostly activity. However you want to phrase it, it's just the blame can often land at the feet of these young girls, which is an incredibly heavy burden to bear. But can I encourage you? The next time you hear a story when someone appears to put a blame for a haunting on one individual, would you please remember the Dagg family haunting? And can you remember how the activity would stop when Dinah left the farm? Not because she was causing it, but because the entity itself said it hated her and wanted her to be blamed. Think about this for a moment. Think about how disturbing this is. When we say a poltergeist or a haunting is connected to one person in particular, we have to be aware that in one sense we're almost saying like they are to blame, that they are the problem. But what if the issue is never the individuals, not the girl at all, but a malicious presence that has chosen to turn that girl into a scapegoat? I'm just saying we have to be careful that when we single out people in hauntings like this, we mustn't just do it in a blame sense, because it may well be that that person has become the innocent plaything of a malevolent force that for some twisted reason thrives on terrorizing and stigmatizing and isolating one individual. A presence that almost luxuriates in their fear and their pain during the haunting, but just as much as in the later accusations, perhaps, that you are faking it. Either response may be equally satisfying to a sadistic force. How often do we say that a young troubled teenager is the biggest cause of the activity rather than its biggest victim? I think it's a horrible thought to think there may be such cruel forces out there, and it makes you wonder if sometimes hauntings really could be demonic in nature after all. I would not be surprised if this particular haunting qualifies for that. I think we should show care and empathy for people who go through this stuff, especially the vulnerable and children. Dinah McLean was both. She lost her parents in Scotland, and she was shipped over to a Canadian orphanage to be sent out as a cheap farm labourer. Then she wound up becoming the supposed epicenter of this cruel and nasty haunting. I naively thought that when the voice was shown to be a liar, the family and the neighbours may have come to defend Dinah after all. Maybe they did in some ways, but ultimately, we found an article from a historian called Arlene Stafford Wilson, and in her research, she found that Dinah was still being blamed for the disturbances, and according to the Kingston Daily News, she was removed from the Dagg's home by Mr. Burgess and sent to live in Fairno Home in Brockville. At the time, it was called the National Orphans Home of Scotland. From one orphanage to another. This home used orphans to work long hours too, often for $4 a month. And over in the nearby town of Athens, you'll find a plaque in a quiet park erected in 1997. It's there to honor these orphans and to mark the injustice that has been done to them. The plaque says that the children became known as Canada's little slaves. It's even thought that 10% of all Canadians today are descended from these children. Dinah McLean was already burdened in life, well before she was ever blamed for the famous haunting of Dagg Farm. How ironic it is, then, that when you look up Dinah's full name in the historical records, you'll see that she has a middle name. She's literally called Dinah Burden McLean. The thought of this vulnerable young girl being shipped across the world and walking up to a farmhouse in Canada is heavy enough, but the idea of a malevolent spiritual presence waking up at the sight of her walking down that pathway, energized by the thought of destroying her life further, is chilling. What happened to Dinah? Well, she did keep a connection to the Dagg family, though it led to a rather disturbing end. We found an article in the Ottawa Citizen, and it's reported that Dinah went to visit Willie Dagg, described her as her uncle, at Portage de Fort. While there, a mysterious man came to the door, and this stranger had a note, and he claimed that this note was signed by George Dagg, asking for Dinah to come back home to the farmhouse. Perhaps Dinah thought she was about to be reunited again. So Willie Dagg said, okay, and Dinah left with this mystery man whose name we can never know, because the article then includes this tiny yet devastating line, almost said as a throwaway, that after she left with that mystery man, Dinah Burden McLean was never seen again. Who was he? What was he? Where did she go? It makes you wonder. Whatever spoke at Dagg Farm fell silent in 1889. But for Dinah McLean, perhaps the haunting never ended. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been watching Into the Fog. Good night.
Oh, it's okay. It's alright. I'll visit you soon.
Thanks to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring today's video. If you want to stay private and secure online as well as unlock global content, check the link in the description for 84% off plus 4 months free and a 45-day money-back guarantee from CyberGhost VPN.